Thank you, and thank you for having me. And I'll begin as my esteemed colleagues have begun, which I'm not a tax expert, but I'm sharing a slot with a true tax expert, my colleague Jim Sallee, so I'll keep my comments fairly brief, but I really appreciate being asked to be part of this event, because what I work on and think about is pollution regulation, and in particular cap and trade, which, as Kathy mentioned, eyes glaze over, and we're almost getting close to lunch, so don't glaze over. I'm going to try and keep you engaged and give you a quick, it's not that complicated introduction, and really connect the dots as I see them between cap and trade, and particularly carbon pricing and community local health issues. But cap and trade, it's not that complicated. So just my 1 minute introduction. So if we think about pollution, it's a textbook externality, right? So absent any regulation, we producers, consumers don't factor in the damages associated with pollution in their production and consumption decisions. So if you don't have regulation there, the power plant isn't thinking about pollution damages when it's making its production decisions. You're not thinking about pollution damages when you're making your energy consumption, your gas purchasing decisions. And so the idea with pollution regulation is to try and change behavior, either through regulation and limits or through incentives. So we can have a carbon tax or a pollutant tax where you estimate, easier said than done, the social cost of pollution, and then charge a tax, so the corresponding tax to change behavior and draw consumption and production decisions closer to a socially optimal level. Or you can try cap and trade. And basically how cap and trade works is the regulator sets a total limit on pollution. So that assumes or presumes that the regulator has a sense of where we want pollution to be, the more appropriate balance struck between costs and benefits. And then she distributes a corresponding number of permits. So think about the regulator handing permits to power plants and cement kilns and pick your favorite emitting industry. And I want to make a point that I think is sometimes lost, because I think cap and trade is sometimes vilified vis-a-vis more standard approaches like prescriptive regulations, but it's really similar in the sense that the regulator is handing the right to pollute to an industry, saying you can pollute X amount, just as she used to under a more prescriptive regulation that says you can't exceed this amount, right? The key difference is that these permits are tradable. And this warms the hearts of economists. Why? Because it's really hard for a regulator to know how to allocate the right to pollute to minimize the cost of achieving your target. And the more aggressive our targets, the higher the cost of meeting them. And so it really helps us to harness the power of the market, to speak like a true economist, to seek out those low abatement costs and deploy those first. So cap and trade program, you allocate the right to pollute, a number of permits corresponding to your total target, and firms are able to trade these in a market. And in theory, if you're imagine, it may be hard to imagine you're running a cement kiln, you are going to reduce your own emissions in-house. You're going to do whatever, tighten your valves or whatever you do, until the cost of doing so in-house equals the permit price. And at that point, if you're a profit maximizing operator, which presumably you are, if you're in the cement business, you're going to stop reducing your own emissions and start purchasing permits from other sources, right? And so that's the sense in which a market can coordinate pollution activity. And it doesn't always work that beautifully in practice, of course, but that, in theory, is what a cap and trade program is supposed to do. Okay, so back to pollution. Pollution, like income, is really unequally distributed. And by some measures, it's more unequally distributed across communities than income. And this is a problem, right? Because as we know, and you know more than I do, being health professionals and health experts, that a lifetime of exposure to high pollution levels can have real impacts on education outcomes and employment outcomes and health outcomes. So this is something we should be concerned about. And here in California, we very much are. And so California has made it a priority to ensure that new environmental regulations worry about efficiency and cost effectiveness, as I just talked about, but also thinking about improving communities in improving conditions in disadvantaged communities. And in some senses, that can produce or generate a difficult trade-off between minimizing the costs of meeting our ambitious environmental targets and emissions targets and making sure that the benefits are equitably distributed. And this debate really, it was the climate change debate that really drew me into this, how important this trade-off is and how important it is to negotiate it carefully and think carefully about the consequences of our policy decisions. So like I just said, economists really get excited about the idea of using a market to allocate pollution reduction responsibilities and abatement responsibilities to minimize the costs of our ambitious targets. So I should say, right now, California is aiming to bring greenhouse gas emissions reductions in the state 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. And that makes past reductions, which we are celebrating as we should, look modest, right, or small. So this is a really ambitious target. So it is important to think about minimizing the cost of meeting that target. But what the environmental justice community has argued correctly is that relying on market-based approaches may deliver the most cost-effective solution, but it may not deliver the most equitable solution. And we need to be thinking about those trade-offs really carefully. I think the one thing that makes environmental justice concerns even more complicated and delicate in the context of global climate change policy is carbon pricing through cap and trade is targeting a global pollutant. When we're thinking about climate change, the climate damages associated with a ton of carbon, it doesn't matter where that carbon happens. Canada, China, California, right? So what are we doing talking about local environmental problems in the context of global climate change policy? One might ask that question, and I have asked that question. And I think there are a couple reasons. One, local pollutants that are so problematic for these low-income and traditionally disadvantaged communities, think about particulate matter or ozone precursors or toxics, are often correlated with greenhouse gas emissions. So people talk about co-benefits. You reduce carbon, you reduce local pollutants, but not always, right? So for example, if a refinery wants to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions, it might do so by running its scrubber less often, because running your scrubber that takes the SO2 or the particulates out of your emissions requires energy. So it's not always safe to assume that reductions in carbon are going to reduce the local problems that we're so concerned about. The other reason why I think local pollution problems were very much in the mix during the climate, or they are very much in the mix when we're thinking about California climate policy, and this was something I frankly didn't appreciate until I sort of came to the table and tried to understand, is that I think that local communities feel like they don't have very much political power. They've been trying to draw attention to local environmental problems for years and years, and they haven't been getting much traction. The California climate debate, they realized this was an opportunity to steer the conversation to concerns they were worried about. And I think that was a legitimate political observation, and that's what they did. So I do think, though, that, like I said, one thing that's complicated is that the correlation between local pollution and global pollutants is not perfect. And so there are many economists, including myself, saying, why are we trying to target a local environmental problem with a policy tool that's aiming at a global greenhouse gas emissions problem? And so I think the arguments that were made, and actually this is the direction that California is going, which I think is a good one, but I really hope to hear from you all, is to say the following. Let's design a cap and trade program or a market-based program to deal with the carbon problem, to coordinate abatement in the least cost fashion. But let's use the revenues that are generated and really commit to using the revenues that are generated to address the problems in local communities. And that's what we're seeing happening. There was two bills, AB 398, which extends the cap and trade program, but then also AB 617, a companion bill that commits to increase local monitoring of pollution, to supporting local governance and local planning for addressing local health problems that are associated with co-pollutants and toxics, et cetera. And there's also earmarking of funds from the revenues of cap and trade programs to investments in environmental justice communities, et cetera. So, you know, it's a leap of faith. It's got to happen, right? This is the promise that's on the table, but I do think there's real potential here, especially for people in this room to get involved, taking this as an opportunity to really do a better job of monitoring exposures in these communities, bringing these communities to the table when you've identified a problem to figure out a solution, and also to better understand the link between pollution and health outcomes in these communities. So I'll leave it there and turn it over to my colleague, Jim Sallee. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you. I was to say thank you for inviting me, but Meredith invited me. She said she'd been invited to come and talk about taxes, and my office is across the hall from Meredith's, and I am in fact a tax economist. And she said, maybe you should talk about taxes. And so I agreed to take a couple of minutes of Meredith's time. But I will try to, there are many things I would like to talk about, but I will try to keep it very brief so we have some Q&A and can get to lunch on time. And the perspective I have to offer is from the academic economist perspective. Academic economists have thought a lot about taxes for a long time, and I think a lot of the insights and sort of lessons learned from a variety of sort of subfields within tax economics are relevant, in particular thinking about how to design tax policies and also how to evaluate them and how to measure their impacts and how to measure sort of the welfare impacts, accounting for a variety of different things. I want to spend the few minutes that I have talking about two themes that are sort of first and foremost in the work that I'm doing myself right now, which is thinking and dovetails nicely off of what prior speakers have focused on, which is thinking about how to use the revenue that you might have in hand as a result of having put a tax on some sort of a bad. So I guess we shouldn't call it a sin tax. I don't know. It's a happy health tax that you have on cigarettes or alcohol or pollution. What do you do with that revenue? And to highlight the importance of that for dealing with the concerns that we might have about the unintended consequences, especially related to regressivity. And also specifically, I want to call attention to the importance of heterogeneity and differences across people and the impacts of these policies. And so just starting off with, I think, what everyone has sort of understood and been mentioned several times, these sorts of policies are regressive at first stage. So they are going to impact whether it's a carbon tax or a pollution tax or whether it's alcohol or cigarettes or sugary beverages. The initial burden of these policies will be disproportionately on low-income people. We also know, and we have a lot of literature looking at this and environmental taxes and other taxes. It's not that hard to use the revenue and redistribute it, either through program expenditures or simply giving money back to people by lowering their taxes or actually writing them a check. Right? So we have a modest cap and trade program in California that raises revenue, and we actually get a rebate on our utility bills twice a year. It's just a lump sum rebate that comes back to people. You're essentially getting a check back. We can make these policies progressive on average relatively easily by just jiggering how we redistribute that revenue and use it. But one thing that I think is often overlooked when someone, and many analysts stop there and overlook the next step, which is just to note that even if you've made such a policy progressive on average, it is still the case that many low-income people will be harmed in the sense that many of the people because not all people are alike. And so and if you look at the data, any of these things, carbon or cigarettes or alcohol, the amount of variation in how much people consume of these things within people who are similar income is much larger than the differences across the income categories. So there's enormous heterogeneity in how much alcohol or cigarettes or gasoline households of the same income consume because of a variety of different reasons. And what that means is that even though we can make a policy progressive on average so that low-income households are not hurt on average, it is incredibly difficult to design a policy that uses the revenue so that no low-income households or no low-income communities would be have a net harm impact from a policy even once you distributed the revenue. And so some of my own work on this right now is focused on gasoline and energy consumption, but the data I'm working with suggests that you can only predict about 10 to 20% of the variation in alcohol and tobacco consumption using a very broad set of demographic variables that might be part of a tax system, like income, household size, geographic location. Most of the variation is unpredictable and therefore is not going to be something you can target particularly well. And so I want to, I think, stop there and open up time for questions. I want to make two quick, very small separate points that are not necessarily on that theme. One is just we also, an interesting branch of tax economics recently has been focused on salience of different taxes. And in the context of a sugary beverage tax or a cigarette tax, what you want is a very salient tax. And there's actually some really nice experimental evidence demonstrating how important it is that the tax be assessed before the cash register. because people are not they're not as responsive to taxes that aren't on the shelf price. And so that's a very small matter, but it's important if you're designing these kinds of policies that whatever the point at which you put the tax in the process will make sure that it is reflected on the price that they see off the shelf, and that there isn't a differential tax added at the register that isn't in the price that they first see. And the second thing I just wanted to end with is an optimistic note for me, which is just to plug the fact that economists in these areas increasingly have access to really fantastic data, both on sort of measuring who is impacted by different policies, who benefits from which types of programs, and also doing things like measuring pollution and exposure and consumption of different things in a much more granular way than we've been able to even in recent years. So many people are now using sort of the universe of tax returns at the federal level or at California level to measure the impact of different policies and to link different impacts or environmental exposures to long-term outcomes using tax data. And lots of the students that Meredith and I advise at Berkeley are using things like remote sensing satellite data to measure pollution levels at the granular levels all over the world, and including an increasingly fine-grained resolution to measure impacts and exposures of lots of different things. And so I think that the theoretical insights are increasingly going to be able to be married with actual empirical measurement to do better design and also better evaluation. Okay, so I'll stop there. Thank you.